You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bryan Most, SVP of Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. Thanks again to all the listeners out there. We very much appreciate the feedback that we've been getting on the show. We continue to be encouraged when we hear what's on your minds and what you'd like us to talk about on upcoming podcasts. Now, usually we get the feeling that you want to hear about what's happening in the market or trends or things of that nature. And we are going to do that. We're going to spend a bit of time at the beginning of the podcast talking about what's happening out there in the world of supply chain. But then there was a topic that came up where we were asked to talk about some of the greatest lessons learned over our times working in supply chain and how those might apply to what's happening today in supply chain. So that'll be fun to talk about some of those things, maybe give everybody a little bit of a break from the chaos that's going on out there. But Don, let's start first with the market update. Certainly lots still happening out there in the world. And what are you hearing these days?
Yeah, I think with the current situation with the Golden Week holiday and also some of these reported power issues, apparently that there's been some outages due to coal and the consumption of coal, so that you've seen some plants shut down or some throttling back of production. And as such, there's been some observation that the spot rate has fallen, and which has created some headlines on different periodicals. And so some question, and some people have asked me like, hey, what do you think? Have you seen this? What's the future outlook? And based on what I see and what I hear, I don't really see any sort of collapse, if you will. Certainly it makes sense that there is some capacity that has become available due to the slowdown. But to say that changes the future outlook, I don't think anything's changed on the future outlook. I think there is still an expectation that inventory is going to be tight. I mean, you can see that in the data that inventories are tight. We know that there are things happening in the beginning of the year. I think West Coast labor situation is still an issue, and something that I expect to be pretty tough discussion, which is a typical negotiation. But I think in a market where you see a number of ships parked outside of the West Coast, nobody wants to see any sort of labor stoppage, shortage, slowdown, anything, because, certainly the market can't really handle that. So hopefully that's something that can get resolved quickly, but it's obviously a risk. So I think there's enough things happening out there that hasn't really changed, and it's not really expected to change anytime in 2022.
Yeah, no, I mean, based on everything I see, I would tend to agree with you. I mean, we're going to have, this thing move up and down, throughout the next couple of years. But when you look foundationally at supply and demand, to your point, not much has changed. We know that demand is still there. It's strong. There's months of backlog in a lot of origin locations. There's not going to be this miraculous new capacity that comes online, even though you do continue to hear of people chartering ships and, even converting from container into bulk and all kinds of crazy stuff. I think we'll continue to still hear those because people are still feeling pain and challenges in figuring out any way they can to move cargo. But to your point, I'm not sure that this affects any contracting, any future contracting, or I certainly wouldn't let it affect my future strategy if I was building one right now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's anyone's prerogative to say, they can interpret the data in different ways. And they're certainly welcome to say, oh, I think things are going to get better, so I might hesitate on doing something either early or long term. That would be my recommendation. My recommendation is that if you can lock up capacity early, that makes a ton of sense, because I think in April, it's my sense is there's not going to be a lot of capacity left, that most of that is going to get allocated sometime before then. Can't really speak to a percentage right now because I think there's just quite a bit of discussion. But I mean, the matter of fact is that there are contracts being signed at this point in the year for next year, which I think is an indication that that's going to continue up until the spring of next year.
Yeah, I mean, we see contracts being signed for January 1. I've even heard of some contracts being signed already for May of next year and everything in between. So to your point, I think the traditional contracting window is probably not going to happen. I think that people are going to go early and they're going to lock up what they can. And if it's not for 12 months, it might be for 24 months or more. Again, depending upon your risk tolerance or, your approach to the business. But more and more, I hear people talking about longer term agreements that are actually, again, getting signed.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, just for our listeners' benefit, that we have had some contracts ourselves signed in the past quarter. So the data comes in from things we're hearing in the market, but things also we're seeing ourselves as a company. And I think, the expectation is that's going to continue for the next quarter. So again, I don't see any slowdown in momentum in terms of that idea of early or multi-year leading into the next contract cycle.
Yeah, I do think, though, the problem still is just the congestion that you talked about still. And again, the West Coast gets all the headlines, but it's not just the West Coast anymore that has ships at anchor, right? You even see that happening up and down the eastern seaboard as well. Not nearly as many ships, but you still see that. And typically, Golden Week for us shippers is really the time where if you don't get your stuff out, it's going to be really hard to get it here and out to the sales floor for customers for Christmas or the holiday season. And so I think that it's one of those where if you haven't got it out by now, it's going to be a real challenge with the congestion. I know some have looked at converting to air freight. The expense, of course, is significant and the capacity is challenged there as well. But unfortunately, there just aren't going to be a ton of options for you at this point.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing more and more, too, in the mainstream media that there's more talk about container shipping and supply chain, which makes me feel good being part of that industry. It doesn't make me feel good necessarily why the reasons why, but it's very interesting to see how this has really become a more part of mainstream media. And it's just largely due to the fact that many of these companies are talking about in their results that they have an inability to get the goods where they need to be. And it's just hard to grow and plan on meeting certain targets when you're not really sure what your inventory and supply chain looks like.
The interesting thing will be is, again, what impact that has on consumer behavior, right? So to your point, I see it on the nightly news as well. The advisories are going out. If you're going to buy Christmas presents, buy them early, right? So it's kind of creating a bit of this panic, right? Or this surge, to buy early, which I think you might see in sales. Now, a lot of that might be holiday, gift giving, kind of one-time events. But to be honest, I hear just the basics again are under, tight supply. I mean, things, again, it sounds crazy, like toilet paper and others. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see just what this does to consumer buying, patterns and habits over the next couple of months. And then again, how that triggers this whole rebuy and what the replenishment cycle looks like right after the first of the year.
I mean, my impression is that there's more of talk, I suppose, that people are saying, look, if you see something and you like it, you should probably buy it. Maybe 2-3 years ago, you might see something and just kind of like, maybe I'll come back and get it, or it'll still be around. And I know myself personally, I've seen it a couple of times where I'm like, hey, maybe I'll get that. And I go back and I'm like, oh, wow, it's not there anymore. Okay, well, I know all the reasons why, but it's really interesting to see how you just don't have the same ability to kind of wait around to make decisions. And me, as a typical late holiday shopper, I got to be on my game pretty early this year.
Well, there you go. So I think that's a pretty good update for what's happening out there in the market. We'll be sure next time we come on to do the same thing. But maybe we just transition, Don, right? I mean, you can maybe talk through some of your thoughts when you thought about the suggestion that we talk about lessons learned and maybe how they apply to what's going on out there today. What are some things that come to mind?
Well, I mean, I think, so this is a question that was brought to us just based on our years of experience, things that we've learned in our careers and how can it apply today. And I mean, I think the first thing is, that's top of mind for me, is that certainly you have to really keep your hand on the pulse of what's happening. It's important to read the situation and really try and be more proactive than reactive. And that might sound obvious, but I think sometimes when you have like budgets and certain expectations and certain goals you define, you really need to have an ability to adjust quickly and not wait until you have some negative results to say, well, maybe that's unrealistic because the market condition changed. I think there really needs to be an ability to move quickly. And I can say in my own career, there have been times where maybe we hung on to certain budgets or targets too long, but then as we kind of learned through that process, we're able to adjust quickly. We could see a much better result, because what happens is when you have these budgets and targets and these goals, which are not really adapting to a market condition, you start to lose some of your salespeople and your teams. They start to lag behind because they recognize that the target isn't really achievable for either, it's an easy target or it's an impossible target. But in those types of scenarios, and that's not to say that's always the case. The point of this is just having that recognition and having the ability to adapt quickly. Because if you're gonna keep your teams engaged and keep your teams focused on what they should be prioritizing, but the goalpost is set somewhere where it just doesn't feel achievable, then you start to lose people. And what you want to do is just really keep your teams engaged. And part of that is just having that agility and ability to adjust quickly. And I've seen that when you haven't done that, that people get a little frustrated. But when you're able to make that adjustment, I see that it creates a lot more engagement with your teams.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great advice. And, you think about just how quickly things have changed just over the past 12 to 24 months. And you quickly see that the more innovative, shippers and carriers out there have embraced the change and the chance to evolve. And so whether that's chartering ships, whether it's converting from container to bulk, whether it's going to 9 primary gateways or ports, I mean, there's a whole host of things, right, that people are doing that maybe they weren't doing before. But to your point, it's because they were staying close to the action and probably put themselves and their companies in a more competitive position than if they wouldn't have changed or done, what they were doing the whole time.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting now being part of a startup is that type of idea of adjusting quickly has really changed, or has accelerated because of us being at a startup. And of course, we don't have all the connectivity of a large organization where you have maybe a volume budget that's connected to an operational budget that's connected to a utilization budget and all these different things. So this is all kind of tangled together. I mean, we certainly don't have that, but I mean, it's terrific being part of a startup where you are able to adjust, because we're doing on a much faster basis. Again, we don't have those other things which are linked to what we're doing. We have pretty much a clear mission, but again, you see when as we adjust and as we pivot to different things internally, I mean, I think the level of engagement you see just as a comparison from a large company to a startup, that at a startup, everyone's really switched on because the goal adjusts quickly, that there really isn't a lag at a startup.
Yeah, no, it really made me think about, one of mine which was the same thing, right? Just this embracing, change and evolution over time. I'm certainly, not the person that I was when I certainly first started, in this industry, and the ability to just constantly learn and challenge yourself. I think many of us have heard the quote, right? The only constant in life is change. And so at some point, the idea of embracing it, even though it's uncomfortable, and just getting that mindset to say, hey, look, to your point, I'm going to continue to grow. I'm going to embrace, I'm going to learn, I'm going to apply, new tools, new processes. I'm going to learn from peers. I'm going to benchmark. All those things are really, really important. When I think back to my career, even though I've worked for some of the larger, BCOs and carriers out there, there was still so much to learn, because sometimes as a larger entity, you do get comfortable in your current process and where you're at, and you're not staying in touch with those that are truly innovating and that are fighting and going through challenges. And we've seen a lot of that right through our exchange. A lot of small and medium-sized shippers have looked at using process and technology as a way to essentially level the playing field in a really difficult environment and get performance levels that would be the same or even sometimes better as some of the big guys. And so I think it's really just this mindset of just over time embracing change, being willing to try new things. And then obviously that change over time just helps you evolve, right, into something that hopefully is what you'd ultimately like to be. I'm not sure you ever get there, but this idea, to your point, of embracing change and just having that mindset that says, we're not going to get too comfortable.
Yeah, I think a lot about change, and I've been on a couple of different projects where it was really change management or transformation of a department or a function or a function and processes. And it's been really great to witness how that works and what are some of the keys to success. And you're right. I mean, it's about embracing change, because I know that there's some people that sort of hang on and dig in and are resistant to that change. And I think it's really important. And again, this might be obvious to some, but I can say from experience, it's not obvious to everybody, is that you're so much better off just trying it and then giving feedback of like what worked and what didn't, and giving things a fair chance, versus just digging in and saying, I can continue to do things the same way. Because most people I know don't think that everything or the environment they work in or everything they do is perfect. And in an environment that isn't perfect, there's an opportunity for change. And so you can't really fault anyone for trying to implement changes when you know that there's flaws in what you do. So it's important that people recognize that and say, well, if I'm planning on making things better or altering something I'm doing, I have to embrace some component of change. And I think there's some other factors that are helpful to give people more comfort when it comes to change management. And that is on the back end of change, that you start to talk about, okay, what did we learn? What are the lessons learned? And what are the things that we need to change as well? Because if it can't just be like, we're on this path and we're not going to deviate from it. You have to have an ability to kind of check in and say, okay, this was our hypothesis, but is this true? Or are there other things that we just didn't know until we got here and we're able to now adjust because now we have some practical experience? And I think also, you have to kind of judge, what is your tolerance for failure? I think sometimes you learn through failure. And if it's impossible to have any sort of failure in that change process, then that creates a bit of a different environment too. And that might also create a resistance to change where it's like, hey, this thing's got to work and it's a mission critical item. Well, again, that kind of sets the table. It's a little bit different from just like trial and error, iterating, learning. So I think it's important to not just talk about change and say, hey guys, we're going to have this change and this is what we're implementing, but what else are you going to do next? When are we checking in? When are we validating some of these hypotheses? And what is our ability to alter the course, and not to go back to where we were, but just to be able to alter the course so that you can course correct and get on the right track to get to that end destination you were looking for.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And you talk about having to bring, your team and people into it. And I would tell you that's certainly been one of the things I've reflected upon. And I believe it now more than ever, even though I'm at a technology company, is that people and relationships still matter, right? I mean, without a doubt, technology and process are going to lead the way. They're going to be critical, right, to drive efficiency in operations. But this idea of saying we're going to let technology and process lead, but it's still all enabled by people, right? I mean, at the end of the day, there's a person that's typically on either end of the technology or the process. And so just going through the last couple of years, yes, it's been important to lean on the people and the relationships that you've developed over time. Without a doubt, you've had to change and evolve and apply new learnings to it. But people, still need to be connected. And, they have feelings, wants, and desires that are all part of this. And, when I think about, people and relationships, when I was, kind of in my supply chain manager role, you had your team, you had your executive team and your internal stakeholders. And then, of course, you had your third party, your providers, and whether they were ocean carriers, trucking partners, warehouse partners, what have you, there were kind of different relationships within that. There were obviously the strategic relationships where you've got one or two that are going to be your primary go-tos. You're going to invest quite a bit of time. There's going to be trust and innovation and, alignment kind of across, the senior executives. And it's more of a long-term, type of an approach to the business. Of course, there were the basic relationships, very more operationally focused, did a lot of the blocking and tackling, which were great, and it was what both sides needed. And then, of course, there were more transactional relationships, which again, there's a part of the business that fits. More short-term focused specialty needs in certain areas of the country or certain areas of the world because of the way a network was set up, that someone was perfectly situated, right, to serve that need. But at the end of the day, there were people and teams, right, that still supported that. And I think it's something you forget sometimes just because we talk about all this investment in technology. But for me, people and relationships still are real
Yeah, and
important.
when you talk about that, Brian, I think a lot about this whole idea around emotional intelligence and just having more awareness of how things affect people. And I still think in general in the business world, you can do a better job of just thanking people and telling them when they did a good job. And certainly in this type of environment, I mean, emotions are running high. I mean, it is frustrating to have ships outside a port for weeks and not really know where your stuff is. And at the same time, you have people asking you, hey, Brian, when's this stuff going to get here? Hey, and you have no control, right? And so you can understand that causes a lot of stress. But I think it's just having this awareness that, hey, look, we're all people and we shouldn't. I mean, it's not always easy to do, of course, but we have to treat each other in a very professional way, in a civilized way. But also, I think having that recognition of when people are trying to go the extra mile and really trying to help you, I think goes a long way. And you always have to be mindful of, I don't think anyone's doing anything on purpose to make anyone else frustrated, but it's just a matter of the situation. And I think you can actually help your own situation if you're not creating this fear or frustration when you're dealing with somebody. You're not really having the awareness of how your interaction is affecting somebody else. I think that, maybe my dad worked quite some time ago, in his environment, there was more of a top down and a little bit of a management by fear strategy. And I think today you don't really see that so much anymore, but you still find remnants of people just getting excited and emotional and anything or things like that. And I just think that, having emotions and when you're kind of known for behaving this way, just people can withdraw and not interact with you, and you might be missing opportunities there. So when you're talking about people and the importance of people in those relationships, I think it's just having that emotional intelligence to be aware of, hey, I gotta really be mindful of how I'm behaving and how that affects others, because I want people to want to deal with me. Some of the things we talked about before, customer of choice and partnerships and things like that. Well, you can't just beat on people when things are bad. You have to be mindful and say like, hey, these guys are struggling too, and it's not any easier for them than it is for me. And I don't need to do anything to make this worse for them.
I think that's the important point. Is I think a lot of us as leaders take it upon ourselves to again take care of our own teams. But the idea of just realizing that the suppliers that we choose to work with and service providers are our partners and extensions of our teams. And so to your point, right, just to recognize that they're probably going through a lot as well. And there's no reason, right, that we can't have high expectations of each other and hold each other accountable, but do it in a respectful way and just in an understanding way that we're all trying to get through this thing, even though it's challenging and difficult. But I think it's a good reminder. It's just not internal, it's external as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other things I thought of when we talk about lessons learned and the importance of it is just, I think there's a need and you have to really have an awareness that you need to continue to challenge yourself and really look for ways to learn. And I think, as when you assume those leadership roles, that's really important. But even early in your career, that's important, because I think the benefit of challenging yourself, educating yourself, learning new things, having an idea of what types of options exist in the industry you work in is really important, because certainly it gives you greater consultative skills when you're dealing with commercial roles or teams, but even internally to understand what options are out there and to become sort of a knowledge center. But I think even in a leadership role, people might get comfortable and say, hey, I made it. This is where I need to be. And I'm satisfied. But I think that those leaders that continue to innovate, think differently and learn, they attract that top talent in companies. And I've seen this in my career where people have said, hey, I want to work for this person because I can see that they're trying different things. They're they're mentoring their people. It's somebody I can learn from. And I think when you have that type of environment in your team and you can present that to your subordinates that work with you, you're going to have people say like, hey, you want to work for this person because they're going to really help me in my career. Because if I'm at an earlier stage of my career, I probably want to find those leaders that are innovating, thinking differently, learning different things. Because, I mean, I can't say that there are too many things that I've learned at an early age that have just been exactly the same through my career. There's been a lot of adjustments and changes and different things you need to learn. And your ability to continue to adapt and understand different types of, whether it's a strategy or a technology, it could be a variety of different things. But I think just challenging yourself in education is really important at different stages of your career. But I think that's a pretty good constant that people should strive for.
Yeah, there is no question about it. One of the things that motivated, me and my teams was this idea of trying to keep score, right? Measuring and managing things. But to your point, it was always it wasn't about just achieving the metric. It was just about, how good could we be? How much could we improve? And if we fell short, why did we fall short? What was the root cause and what countermeasures or improvements could we put in place to overcome it? And just that willingness to be able to take a critical eye, right? When you set an aggressive goal or an objective or a metric, you fall a bit short, to take the critical eye, take a look after the fact and say, again, what can we learn? Like, what can we apply? And the idea of, having measures or metrics that truly matter, right? That truly impact the business, not just something that's on a scorecard just to be on a scorecard, but something that truly impacts, the business or the people, right, that are helping perform the business. That was always one of those things that we were able to use to motivate ourselves, but even like our service providers, like our ocean carriers. I can tell you, like when we came out with an official scorecard process, of course, like you as the service provider could see your particular scores, but there might have been one or two that we would let people see like where they ranked amongst others, just to get some competitive juices going, right? Just to get them asking, well, hey, look, I see that I'm third or I'm fifth on this one. Like, what could I do? Or what is the best practice? Or what is someone else doing so I could get better? And it all kind of goes to what you're saying about that continuous learning. But I always thought keeping score and taking a look at, a critical eye for improvement was always part of continuing to learn.
Yeah,
and grow.
Absolutely. And I think, having some data points to refer to measure that, is this really happening, or is it something I think is happening and I'm really staying the same? I think it's important to have some ability to measure and look at that. There's one other thought I had on this topic, and I know it sounds very general, but I think it's really important, and that goes into communication. Because I think that there are so many different ways to communicate these days, and it is can be overwhelming and daunting, especially if you look at it over time, because there's a variety of ways now that we're communicating. But, I think there's some things where what's top of mind for me is really being somebody that can create that trust and reliability with people, as far as if you don't have an answer, and somebody asked you a few days ago. I think having interim replies and communicating with people, just giving them an update that, hey, I'm still working on this. I haven't forgotten about you. But also telling your teams what's going on and what's happening. I think sometimes we make assumptions that, the people on my team may know this, or because I said it somewhere else that it somehow got to my team. And I think it's really important to make sure you have that communication channel that's open, where you can make sure your teams are getting the information, and whether that's something you post somewhere or you have a huddle with your team. But I think there's an importance to doing that, but also that you make time for your employees too, because I can say in my career, I've seen times where we were doing some fact finding and checking, and some of the people had indicated to my team that they're like, wow, I just wish my manager would just make time for me. They seem so busy. I know they're doing a lot of great things, but there's some things I'd like to talk about. And it just highlights that, sometimes you think that you might be talking to somebody or really communicating with them, but you're not really giving them the opportunity to share some of the insights or learnings or some of the things that they're excited about. And I think when it comes to pulling people together and really getting your team moving in one direction, it's important to communicate. And certainly in this environment where, it's very difficult, I think that whole idea around making sure you're giving people updates, telling them that you're still working on it so that they're just not as frustrated when a week goes by and they don't have an answer. It's just important to stay on top of these things and really be mindful of how we communicate with the stakeholders that we're interacting with.
Now, I think that's such a good one, right? And that's been challenged over the past couple of years by not being able to be in person, right? How do you adapt and adjust communication when you can't meet person to person, in the same room? And you have to use technology and all those things. So I think it's a really great one because, for me, it was about learning how to be really clear, right, with my communication and clarity around expectations. I mean, it's something we actually talk about at Night Checks a lot, right? Clarity of contracts and expectations. That way it truly drives alignment. And then, all parties essentially have the shared goal. Like they all know what they're working towards when there's true clarity in that communication and expectations. And, one of the things we used to do is we used to take the time when I was at Walmart to have an annual carrier conference. We would invite in all of our providers, not just ocean carriers, over the road providers, et cetera. And we'd let them all, get an update on what was happening across the company. We would have different business leaders come in and share not just about supply chain or logistics, but company growth ambitions and what countries or what expansion plans we were thinking about. Of course, we would talk specifically about supply chain initiatives that we had, and we'd share timelines and what the next RFP would look like, et cetera. But it was really that one time a year where collectively as a group, we could come together and drive, really clear communications that says, here's what we want to accomplish this year. Here's why we want to accomplish it. And more importantly, here's what you can do to help us accomplish it. And it always really came off really well.
Yeah. And I think your point about, the current environment where there's such a higher propensity to be on a video call than an in-person meeting. And I think that really requires you to put in some extra effort, especially those in leadership roles, to make sure you're communicating with your team, because I think it's more difficult, right? I've just had some interactions with a group in person, and, you see how much easier it is when you're all together that you can just, walk over and talk to somebody and say, hey, I want to talk to you about this. Whereas you can think back to like, wow, when I'm just, at home on Teams, it's sometimes hard to get people or get as many people together because there's so many different meetings and conversations happening at the same time. So it just underlines that importance that you really have to put in the effort, and it's so important to do. But I think that extra effort will absolutely pay off in the long run, because then your teams, again, are more engaged and there's better alignment on what's happening.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. The last one for me that I thought about, and it kind of goes with the people and the relationships, because a lot of things in this crazy market are happening because of people and relationships, but a lot of what's at the heart of those people and relationships are just kind of values and integrity, right? I mean, there are people in this industry that are just great people that have been mentors to me, people that I've worked as peers with, people that I've competed against 20 plus years. But at the end of the day, I've always felt that it was an industry that truly was based on core values. I always felt like there was a degree of respect and honesty. And yes, of course, you can have your differences. You can negotiate, hard. But this idea that there truly is an authenticity about the relationships. I don't know what it is, but, we haven't been at conferences for the last year or two. But I'm sure once we go to the next one and everybody's back in the same room again, a lot of those feelings will come back. And I think it's just important, right, to think about over your career, just like, what are your non-negotiables? Like, what are the basic fundamental beliefs that you have? I mean, obviously live them out every day, because it only takes one slip up, right, to just tarnish that reputation. But I think if you're a person viewed of, this is what I believe, and then more importantly, I have the integrity to live it out every day, that trust is there, and that is going to open up doors for opportunities, again, to learn, to do new deals, to be creative. And I just think that's really important, because I think a lot is happening in this marketplace today because there is a degree of trust and relationship that still matters out there.
I totally agree, Brian. I think integrity and values and beliefs are extremely important, especially today, because it's hard to build trust when there's so many things going wrong on an operational basis, which again, I don't think it's anyone's at fault or there's any sinister ideas out there to make causes deliberately. But I think the other thing is that you just have to, have a level of authenticity to what you're saying. You have to understand and probably a bit of empathy as well, that you have to understand how frustrating it can be. I mean, there's businesses that have certain goals. And I think just to deliver that message, one where you are understanding what your audience is going through. And I guess when I'm saying this, I'm referring to like from a carrier perspective, right? Because I think for carriers, it's not easy for them to feel like, hey, I'm sure you're disappointed with what's happening. And again, it's not because they aren't trying. It's not for a lack of effort. But, when there's 60 ships outside of a port, it's just going to take time to clear those out. And that's just a matter of fact. So I think you're right, though. I mean, I think it's making sure that it's clear and maintaining that your values are clear, delivering your messages with integrity. I think that's great. And that's very important.
Well, hey, look, I know you and I both, leaving, large, well-established organizations to come into a startup world, right? We still have lots of opportunities to learn and grow and be challenged. It's certainly been a lot of fun to do it, but I certainly look forward to continue to learn and grow and evolve over time.
Yeah. I mean, I think, now being on this side, I mean, I think it presents a whole other set of opportunities. And I mean, you just see how startups work with like their agility and ability to move quickly, which is fun and, keeps two guys like us on our toes that we can still, keep up with the best of them. And it's awesome. It's been a lot of fun.
There you go. Well, hopefully those insights help some of our listeners out there, at least provide a bit of entertainment, again, amongst all the chaos that continues to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we always want your feedback. I mean, this was something our listeners had asked for, so we're happy to share. And please continue to give us feedback, rate us, review us, wherever you find us on social media. Hit that like button. And we'll see you next time, guys. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.